If you snapped at your team, missed a target, or you felt overwhelmed at home, would that mean that you've behaved poorly or that something is fundamentally wrong with you? Because for a lot of high-performing leaders and parents, those two things slowly become the same thing: behavior and identity. When that begins to happen, we find that every mistake feels deeply personal. A missed deadline becomes I'm undisciplined. A difficult conversation that you've wanted to avoid becomes I'm not a good enough leader. Not being able to connect with your kids all the time becomes I'm not a good enough parent. And essentially, when that behavior becomes your identity, shame begins to run your leadership, begins to run your home, begins to run you. In this session, I'm going to break down three things. First, the mechanic of behavior and identity fusion. So essentially how behavior slowly becomes mistaken for identity. Second, why this pattern shows up so strongly for high performers, and why it quietly drives burnout. And third, on how you can start separating behavior and identity so that mistakes become a skill gap versus a continuous self-shame and blaming process. If we haven't met before, my name is Nick Von Pitt. I work with founders, executives, high-performing leaders, and parents, successful on paper, but find themselves internally stretched and always on. Most of the people that I work with don't have a strategy problem per se, but they do have a capacity problem. When your internal capacity drops, your nervous system regulation, emotional management, clarity, and identity stability begin to wobble. And that's when your leadership becomes reactive, your relationships begin to take strain, and success begins to feel heavier than it should. And the concept that we are unpacking today, identity and behavior fusion, is foundational around, well, why that all happens. So let's walk through how this fusion actually works. The mechanic of identity and behavior fusion. So how behavior becomes mistaken for identity. So when we look at why high performers burn out, it typically comes to seeing how they've over-identified with this behavior, and that's what they believe themselves to be, essentially. So let's separate identity and behavior just to create more clarity. So keep in mind that the brain constantly confuses these two systems, the different inputs, be it identity and behavior. So identity, this internal sense of self, we all have that. It's non-observable. It's this core I am. I'd even expand that into it's the consciousness that resides within us. And there's psychological continuity. It's the your beingness, for better use of the term. Moving into behavior, these observable actions. There's a measurable output to said behavior. There's also a start and stop to it. There's situational responses. So there's context, and it is state dependent depending on that emotional barometer and where you're sitting within the landscape of your feelings. Then we start looking at the visibility bias. So the brain trusts what it can see. I repeat that. The brain trusts what it can see. And behavior ends up being visible. So it's like, oh, I see that. I can identify with that. I understand what and where this is coming from. Identity is invisible. So it's, oh, how do I tangibly grab onto this thing? It's very difficult to attach to that. The brain prioritizes observable data. So keep in mind, the brain works in an incredible way because it basically has to assimilate all this information, and it has to chunk that down through different filters to essentially make sense of what you are experiencing at any given time and your perspective. So it's a quick mental shortcut for processing complex information about other people. That's probably the easiest way to do it. And so you can build up a picture. It's a sense of safety that ends up being established because you're able to threat detect what's in your space through this means of observation. And then we move to the result. What I see is who you are. So essentially, then you assign meaning through this visibility or this observation. And within that, there's a boatload of assumptions that arise. And the bias is an entry point for this identity distortion, be it for people or yourself. So this is where it gets interesting. This is what the sequence actually looks like. So the fusion sequence, the brain converts events into identity through a predictable sequence. So you've got a trigger event. We'll run that into more detail. You then move into behavior. You then go into the meaning that is assigned to that behavior, as we just touched on, and the identity attachment, and then it's the nervous system activation. And that's when you're diving into your fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And this error occurs when that meaning becomes identity. So let's start with the neutral trigger. Events are informational and not personal. Keep that in mind. Events are just raw data. They possess no inherent meaning until they are processed. That's the distortion takes place. So missed revenue target, child's emotional outburst, team members, lateness, and rejected proposal. A couple of examples. We then move into step 2, which is behavior as the output. So behavior is a system output, not character evidence. So there's a dysregulation or a skill gap. Behavior reflects so your nervous system state, your emotional load, and your capacity limits. So keep in mind, the behavior that is going to be coming up is also a direct reflection of where you're at in terms of capacity, your regulation, where you are in terms of that emotional barometer. That's very important. That will also skew the distortion or distort it even more. So behavior state dependent, not identity dependent. Keep that in mind. We then move into step 3, which is the narrative layer. So this is where we are going to go and create those wonderful stories. The brain generates a story faster than it generates truth. Keep that in mind. That's what we do all the time. We create stories, we distort information. Very rarely can we account for our day exactly as it happened. We have a unique perspective. You can have two people standing, having the exact same cup of coffee by the same barista, and one person will have a completely different experience to the other. It might be similar, but it will not be the same. So you've got your raw data, you've got the story. Why did this happen? What does this say about me? Is this a threat? Whatever the case is. And then you've got the distorted data. So remember, the brain is seeking a fast answer, not one that has to be true. It wants to close that loop so it can close that tab. And this is where the distortion enters. So again, the story, the distortion ends up being the bridge between the identity and the behavior. We then look at the identity attachment. This is essentially the glitch. So once you've made this distortion, we are going to be looking at how these two things connect. So you've got this gap that is filled where information ends up becoming identity. So example, he missed a deadline. Identity, he's unreliable. Action, I snapped at my team. Identity, I'm a bad leader. Action, sales dropped. I'm not capable. And notice it really does follow I am, because that's you speaking to that I am. Notice when we go back to that second slide where we talked about I am as identity, you are declaring that over yourself as well. And so you believe it. Your nervous system then treats identity threats as survival threats. Keep that in mind. So what happens? Nervous system response. So there's an identity threat that activates survival circuitry. So the logic chain, you've got belonging equals a survival threat. So performance pressure then becomes a biological threat response. Just think about that logically. You are basically performing because of the mechanic that has been inserted in your system, which is there just to keep you safe. That's why you're performing, because you feel like you're constantly under threat. And if you do not perform, then something bad will happen. And we have distorted that behavior with our identity. In leadership, this is quite an interesting one. So you can liken this to a pilot. So if you've got a fuse leader and he is experiencing this internal turbulence, there's defensiveness, there's panic, there's a situation happening at the company, maybe he lost a big client, maybe there was a massive issue on there's a late deadline, whatever the case may be, and he's projecting that out and you're feeling that. Essentially what happens is that gets felt. That projection is then felt. So then people are going to attune to that. And so that distortion is going to take place alongside all their work around how they're feeling. It's going to affect their state. It's going to affect their nervous system. And so at the end of the day, they affect how they see themselves. They might self-blame. They might feel unsafe. And that will affect performance and in turn your bottom line and your culture, if we're going to extend that even further. But then you have someone that's a sturdy leader. You've got someone that has the ability to separate said turbulence from their capacity. They're able to regulate, they're able to be in a space of safety. What that is then projected out into the workspace. And people feel that. And people interact and treat and move through whatever they're having to navigate with a lot more grace and space, and probably end up making better decisions along the way. And the big difference is, it's firstly this, when we're just referring to ourselves, you have framed it in such a way where you are in control of yourself, and there's this externalized experience that is taking place. And even if there was an action or two that you had taken, behavior that was not effective, that possibly had resulted in X, Y, and Z, you're not blaming yourself, and it hasn't lessened your ability to lead effectively. So identity fused leaders end up defending themselves. Identity stable leaders correct behavior. So this is that whole piece of accountability and ownership that begins to come in. So the internal collapse, that self-fusion. So high performers typically sit with this psychological trap, and I've seen this time and time again with my clients. I failed the task becomes I am a failure. I feel overwhelmed becomes I am weak. And this is where I've pieced in the burnout piece, which is it results in chronic nervous system activation, which ends up being this identity pressure and not necessarily work overload. And having gone through burnout and having helped people circumnavigate burnout, I find that this is the thing that releases them, because you'll do all the things, you'll do the R&R, you'll rest, you'll try to change your diet, and all these things are amazing. But until you change that internal landscape, you're going to be beating yourself up and living and reliving this experience over and over again. It doesn't stop. It's 24/7. And so you're never off. You're never able to truly rest. So the full mechanism and the reinforcing loop. Event. We've got a couple examples of that. We move into behavior, state dependent. Now you're not feeling great, or whatever the case may be. Then move into interpretation, fusion. Ooh, how I see this, the meaning, the story. Then we have the shame, threat, response that comes in. We've got the belief there. Shame, threat, response. Shame, how you feel about yourself, how you speak about yourself, what you think about yourself. You've assigned meaning. There's that emotional charge. Now you're shaming yourself. You're shaming yourself into performance. Now you want to do better, but then there's another event that compounds on that. And eventually you've got this internal belief of I am bad, or I'm not good enough. And so we now no longer are just focusing on your your belief, your behavior. You are essentially berating, belittling, and breaking down your self-worth, your identity, and you're doing it. Not anything from the outside, just from how you're seeing yourself. So how do we start recovering? So we need to restore the system and essentially diffusion. Recovery begins when your identity and behavior are separated again. That's fairly obvious, but that gap of analysis is the skill set. So identity, you're good inside, you're stable. That's who you are. Behavior, information, it's fixable. Skill set. When variables are separated, mistakes become feedback and non-existential threats. So existential versus instructional. So there's two ways the brain itself can actually interpret behavior. And I want to liken this to the weather. So fusion makes behavior existential. The storm destroys the ground. Separation makes behavior instructional. The storm is just weather. So behavior, if you liken it to weather, identity related to the ground, they are two separate things. But they do connect and can relate to each other. And it's important because this internal safety depends on this distinction. And it's such a simple way of seeing yourself and your actions, but we don't do it enough. We chunk that up over and over again. So let's really now look at the how-to. Now, how do you essentially shift this fusion once it's taken place? So I'm going to run you through a couple of examples and essentially how I do it for myself and for my clients. So step one is create separation. So pause and visualize. And I love this idea of using two hands. So you can lift up your hands, and one is your identity, one is your behavior. That is really helpful, just to, oh goodness, it's not the same thing. It just puts a light on and it gives you a little bit of awareness. And I love how tangible it is versus just thinking it out. You don't need a pen and paper. You can just do it in the moment, and you could even just do it under your desk if need be, if you're in a heated meeting or situation. We then move into step 2, which is anchor to the baseline truth. So people are innately good inside. That's your baseline. And that might be difficult to swallow initially, but that's a belief that I hold in my system for myself and for others. And it allows me to approach things with a lot more compassion and grace and not have that charge. Instead of labeling the person, describe the behavior. If this person is good inside, naturally good inside, immediately you're starting to create a bit more separation. Like, but they're acting a little bit differently to what I know them to be and who they are. So it's i.e. a good kid that's hitting their brother, or a good employee that's just late. So essentially you want to create that separation from between identity and behavior. And this keeps people reachable instead of them leaning into this defensive space where they just don't want you to communicate and connect to them. So this is when you're dealing with this within another person. That's be very mindful and how you approach them. That's probably a lot easier. Next is address the behavior plus the self repair. So address the behavior. Once the identity is protected, you can communicate clearly. So I appreciate how you show up, but I've noticed you've been late recently. Is something going on? You're using a tone of voice and you're using an approach where you are recognizing the person first. And you're then getting curious. And I think curiosity is another key here, where you get to ask, is there something underneath this? Is there something more to this? And that really gets people to open up. And you also cultivate the sense of respect for the person as you address the behavior. And they tend to be more on board with that as well. Obviously, there are escalations to this as well, but this is the baseline. And then for yourself, it's very easy to do this for other people, or it's easier to create that separation for yourself for other people. But when this is happening within how you're showing up, and this is when you shame spiral, and this is when you're burning yourself out, and this is when you're feeling stuck and you're in this continuous loop, as we showed you earlier. Self-repair is that step. So apply the same principle. Instead of I am a terrible parent, shift to I'm a good parent who had a hard moment. Instead of me being I'm a poor leader, I'm a good leader who just made a mistake. That's okay. We are all human. And that's the invitation with this. It is being able to verbalize something which we tend to group together and not create enough separation, because innately we are good inside. And that I'd like to do it. And just on the principle of I'm good inside, that comes from someone called Dr. Becky. She's a psychologist, brilliant. Please go have a look at her content as well. But in terms of how she has framed people and allowed for more effective conflict resolution, just with this idea of seeing people as good inside. It creates distinction, separation, and allows you to progress through whatever emotional charge might be coming up in that moment. Take what is relevant. I think there's a couple of tools here that you can use, and you can use in your parenting, use in your relationship, use in your leadership in the office, within your team, and it's available to you. It's not that you have to go and write a couple of things down. You can always come back to this, but the intention is for you to be able to practically access this, use this, and take it away with you and add it into your toolkit. So here's a question I want to leave you with. Where in your life is your behavior fusing with your identity? Where does a mistake suddenly become a story about who you are instead of feedback about what happened? Because once you begin to separate behavior and identity, behavior becomes instructional. It's a skill. It is something that you can work on and with, no longer this existential threat to yourself or your existence. And that single shift changes how you lead, how you parent, and how you show up for yourself and in your life. So if you've noticed that you're a little bit more reactive than usual, stretched internally, or like your leadership has become heavier than it used to feel, be it at home or in your business, there's a high likelihood that there is an identity and behavioral fusion that has taken place. at some part in your system. There's a good chance that there's been an identity and behavior fusion that has taken place in some part in your system. And if you want to see exactly where this is happening for you, I've created a resource called the Power Leak Report, specifically designed to help you get clearer on where you're leaking capacity, presence, and power, and essentially where this fusion has taken place. And you can find that in the link below. And if this work resonates with you and is speaking to you at this moment in time, I invite you to apply for private coaching. Link is in the description. And if you'd like to listen to more conversations like this, please subscribe to the Frequency Coaching channel. The last thing that I want to leave you with is that you're capable, you're powerful. And when you understand the difference between who you are and what you do, you get to create space. So you can make better decisions, you can lead with more presence, you can live with more compassion, and you get to do better because you can see things clearer. And as always, the invitation is simple. Make the shift.